Chapter 23, World War I, Section 1, The Road to War. At the beginning of the 1900s, there was peace. However, relationships between European nations weren't relatively friendly. In fact, there was a lot of fear and a lot of distrust growing among European powers. One cause of the tension between European nations was something called nationalism. Nationalism is a strong sense of pride and loyalty to one's nation or culture, and again, it created tension. Nationalism inspired people who shared a language or a culture to want to unite politically. So, for example, in Germany, the leader of Germany in the late 1800s was a guy named Otto von Bismarck. He was the chancellor, if you will. And the king was a guy named Kaiser Wilhelm II. And they wanted to bring together all the German-speaking lands together into one nation of Germany. AustriaHungary, which was a nation at that time, because they had conquered large pieces of land, they included people from all sorts of cultural backgrounds. Many of the Slavic nations that you see in this picture here wanted to join Serbia, who were Slavic as well. So here's Serbia right here in that purple area, but some of these other areas like Montenegro, and there was a place that was called Bosnia that was up in this area. They all wanted to join Serbia because they were similar speaking people. Another source of tension was called imperialism. Imperialism is when nations competed for control of territories both in Europe and in overseas. For example, Great Britain had this very vast empire. They had colonies in Africa, they had colonies in Asia. Of course, with that, it brings wealth and power. Some other places were looking to do the same, have this empire. Germany, for example, looked at a piece of land that was on the border of France and Germany, this place right here called Alsace-Lorraine, and they were German-speaking people, but it belonged to France. So in 1871, Germany invaded and took Alsace-Lorraine and brought it back into Germany because they were German-speaking people. Of course, now France wants it back because it's really their land. Another ism that was a source of tension in Europe was militarism. This is when nations focused resources on the aggressive strengthening of armed forces. Germany, for example, was building up its army. And in a way to protect themselves, they started to form alliances. So Germany would align themselves with Austria-Hungary and places like Bulgaria and Turkey. Great Britain would align itself with France and Russia. So alliances are forming, which allows people to start increasing their military. Like I said, feelings of distrust grew among European powers in the early 1900s. In 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Slavic nationalists resisted violently. The reason why they resisted because Bosnia and Herzegovina had just gained their independence from Turkey, or the Ottoman Turks, I should say, and that was in 1878. In 1908, Austria-Hungary swoops in and annexed them into their empire. The Bosnians didn't want that to happen, so of course they're resisting violently, and they wanted to join their brothers and sisters of Serbia together. This picture here shows you a breakdown of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, of the many different cultures and groups that Austria-Hungary had incorporated. Here's Bosnia and Herzegovina down here, and these are some other groups, the Austrians, the Hungarians, and then other groups around in that country. On June 18, 1914, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was driving through the streets of the capital of the province of Bosnia, called Sarajevo, with his wife Sophie. While riding through the streets, a 19-year-old Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip jumps out and shoots the two of them in the car, killing both of them. That angered, of course, Austria-Hungary and the king, and so Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. And now nations will begin to mobilize for war because Serbia had some allies in like Russia, and it was kind of like a domino effect from there. So now we're getting two sides in this war because Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and now Serbia's allies who are going to back them up. Russia is an ally of Serbia. France is an ally of Russia. Great Britain is an ally of Belgium, who in turn is an ally of France. So all four of those countries now are getting, or five countries, are getting pulled into war against Austria-Hungary. The Central Powers include Austria-Hungary, and their ally was Germany, and also an ally of them is the Ottoman Empire, or the Turks as we call them. Now it's called Turkey. But now we have the two clear sides, the Allied powers of Serbia, Russia, Great Britain, France, and Belgium, and the Central powers of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. So war has started, and both sides really expected the war to be over very quickly, in just a few months. German leaders had planned to defeat France quickly, and they thought by beating France quickly, they would do that before Russia would enter the war. But things didn't go as planned. The Germans will invade. They will first march right through Belgium here, and our goal is to get to Paris, right here. So they will cross through Belgium to get there. And the Germans get pretty close to France, or to Paris, I should say, and the French army stops them at a river called the Marne River. And this became known as the First Battle of the Marne. This was in September of 1914. It was the first major battle of World War I. French and German forces faced each other along a battle line known as the Western Front. This is the western part of Europe, and this is where the majority of the fighting was, in the western part of Europe, in France, along these battle lines. This is the Western Front, and it doesn't really move much from there. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but that's kind of where the majority of the western part of the war was fought, in this area. On the eastern side of Europe, you have Russians and Germans who are struggling back and forth in battle. This became known as the Eastern Front, and you can see that right here. Here's Germany, here's Russia, and the Eastern Front was located right along that particular line there. Same with, this area is known as the Eastern Front. The war became known as a stalemate. A stalemate is a situation in which neither side can win a decisive victory. If you were to use one word, it would be a tie. So far, neither country has gotten the edge, if you will, on both the Western and the Eastern fronts. We are now going to talk about warfare that happened on the land, battles at sea, and battles in the air. So we're going to start with land, and a new type of warfare has begun. It's called trench warfare. Trench warfare was defending a position by fighting from the protection of deep ditches, and this helped make the war long and deadly. The trenches were cold, they were wet and muddy, and then, of course, when you have those situations, you have diseases that run rampant. You can see from this picture here, the situation is all great. Look at all the mud and water and the dirt and mud, and you're outside all the time, and it's cold. That didn't make for great situations. And if there were aerial bombs that were dropping on these trenches, there were some indoor underground kind of bunkers, but a lot of times those bunkers caved in when the bombs hit. New technologies made land warfare even more deadly, like machine guns, poison gases, and tanks. These were all new in use during World War I. The trenches stretched across Europe, Western Europe, for about 400 miles, a network of different trenches. And when warfare happened, you would fight from your trenches until maybe you heard a whistle, and then they all jumped out of the trench, and they fought in an area called no man's land, hand-to-hand combat, and then once that was done, then they would go back to their trenches. Sometimes the enemy would push you out of your trench, and you'd have to run back to another trench, and then you might come back to this trench. It was kind of back and forth kind of fighting. Also in the trenches, you also lived with whatever wildlife might be there. So a lot of times you have rats, eating some of the little food that you had in the trenches. Again, that's all in the way of spreading diseases in these trenches. In airplanes were used in large-scale battle for the first time. They fired down on soldiers in the trenches, they gathered info on enemy locations, and they battled each other in the air, known as dogfights. At sea, fighting in the Atlantic and the North Sea occurred. Both sides used naval blockades and mines to block supply lines. The Germans used a type of submarine called a U-boat that launched torpedoes against Allied supply lines. They will sink many ships in the claiming that they were enemy ships. A lot of times these ships were innocent passenger ships. We'll talk more about that in the next section. That is the end of section 1.